Welcome to the Midi Quest Panel Edit tutorial. This tutorial is intended to cover the panel edit menu commands that are used when you're creating your own editors for Midi Quest. If you're not planning on creating your own editors for Midi Quest, then there's really no need to view this tutorial. I would expect if you're watching this tutorial that you have probably first already watched the panel edit tutorial. Some of these options will have been discussed, but I'm going to go through the menu as it stands and look at each one with whatever degree of depth I feel is required. The first option is cut, and cut will literally take each of your selected controls and place them in a clipboard and remove them from the editor. You then have options such as paste controls, and this would allow you to paste the controls back into this editor or paste them into another editor if you want. If you've made multiple editors, you can certainly cut and paste controls between the editors if that makes development easier. You will notice that if you are working with SoundQuest created editors, that you are not able to cut controls to move over to another editor. Copy is conceptually the same. It would make a copy of the selected controls and place them on the clipboard, but it would leave the existing ones intact. Paste controls will paste cut controls back into the currently selected editor in the same location that they were cut from. And we now have a submenu called Custom Paste. And what this does, by the way, this paste controls is exactly the same as this paste controls option. These options, however, allow you to paste the controls back where they came from, but convert it into whatever type you select. So if you wanted to say cut these controls, you could then paste them all. Cut. You could then use the custom paste option to paste all of them back in as, say, graphic sliders. Now, when you do this, Midi Quest is basically able to copy all of the standard parameters over. It's able to copy all of the custom parameters, the common parameters over. However, the custom parameters end up in their initialized state, so you will always need to alter these on a per control basis. But it does allow you to very quickly, if you want, convert a group of controls from one type to another, if you want. Mouse paste, again, takes the controls which have been placed on the clipboard, and it allows you to paste them in at a particular location. So I can right-click the mouse here and go to Paste at Mouse, and the controls will be pasted in at the location that I selected. And I can do the same thing, paste at a location, and force the control to be a different type. Clear does what you would expect. It deletes the selected controls. And I'm going to clear these, and I'm going to paste back the originals just in case. What Clear Clipboard does is if you have a series of controls currently on your clipboard and for whatever reason you'd like to get rid of them and clear out the clipboard, that's what this option does. If I choose it, then notice right now that you have the paste option available. If I clear the clipboard, I can no longer paste in controls because there aren't any available. Duplicate works with a selected control, and when you choose this option, you get a pop-up dialog which allows you to make, as you might guess, a set of duplicates of the selected control. You can specify where the duplication process starts. You can select a number of duplicates to create, and you can also adjust parameters in each subsequent duplicate. So delta X, delta Y controls the placement of the new controls. So if I have a delta X of 169 and I create 3 controls, they're going to go from the original control location across. And there are my new controls. I could also choose to have them go just down by setting the X coordinate to 0 and say the Y coordinate to 20. I could have them go down and across, however you'd like. I can change the R offset and S offset as each new control is created. That is the retrieve offset here and the store offset. So if I have, let's say, 25 controls that I want to be identical, and I've set up my macros nicely so that they work with the default setup values, I can simply do something like this. Duplicate. Let's duplicate down. If I know they're going sequentially and I'm using the R and S offset values, then I can fill those in to increment sequentially. Or I can also increment the W, Y, and Z. So if I say increment this by 1, increment this by 2, and let's create 5 controls. There are your 5 new controls. And notice how the W value goes 1, 2, 3, 124, 125, 126, and Y goes 4, 6, 8, and 10. Basically, they automatically increment. So you can have, if you set things up smart, you can create one control, get your macro done, and then just duplicate it and have the W, Y, and Z parameters set properly, increment properly, and you've got all your controls. All you have to do is test them. Everything has been set up exactly the way that you need it. And that's the duplicate command. Global macros. You've probably already seen this. Each editor can have up to 250 global macros. Each of these macros can contain any set of macros you want and can reference each other. As you've heard before, you keep track. Don't allow recursion. Don't have macro 1 call macro 0 and macro 0 call macro 1, because you'll just go in a big circle if you're not careful, and that will crash the computer. The macros allow you to create. The next menu option is global macros. Each editor has up to 256 global macros that can be referenced by any one of the controls from the common parameters area for transmit, retrieve, store, or activate. As well, there's an initialization macro in the global parameters section that can call the global macros. We recommend, if you're going to use macros, and you should be, that you do as much as possible of your macro work within the global macros area. Any global macro can call any other macro in the global area. Any macro in an editor can also call any global macro. You've got a lot more working space here as one advantage. The other reason for this, to use this area, is that, say for example, for this control, if you need to change some other display parameters in the editor based on a change to the value of a given control, then you actually need to do it usually in two places. You'll need to call the macro, whatever it is, say 30 here, but when the editor is created, you'll need to correctly initialize this display, which frequently means you'll also need to call macro 30 in your initialization macro. There's an entire tutorial on macros. There may be a second tutorial on macros if need be, so I won't talk about them anymore other than to say the macro is where most of your work within an editor is going to be done as far as processing sysx data and handling display control within the editor. The next option is bitmap list. Again, every editor can have its own bitmap list. The bitmaps used by a particular editor must be in the same folder or directory as the editor itself, or Midi Quest won't be able to access them. And it is simply a list of bitmaps. Now you can actually use on Windows, you can use bitmaps or PNG files. And on the Mac, you can use PICTs or PNG files. Now on the Mac, any PICT file you want to reference as a BMP file, and Midi Quest will automatically make the name conversion. If you don't do it this way, then moving your editor over to the PC, it won't work properly. And at this time, we do recommend that you actually use PNG files instead of bitmap files. They have additional features, they're more compact, and so on. Now, Midi Quest will, if it can't find a BMP file, automatically look for the equivalent PNG file. So if you've created an editor and make a whole series of BMP references, if you change the file format, don't worry, Midi Quest will find them automatically. Bitmap list has a series of features. Browse gives you a file selector, and it will show all of the available BMP files, and you can just load what you need, or you can look for PNG files if you want, and here they are. You can delete an entry from the list. You can shift an entry up in the list, shift an entry down in the list. You can duplicate an entry. This little box shows you the reference number for the entry. So this is bitmap 7 in the list. This is bitmap 25 in the list. You can also add an entry to the list simply by typing in the bitmap name here and press the add button, and it will be added to the bottom of the list. Now, the bitmap list is used by a number of different control types within Midi Quest. One of the most notables is the toggle control. If you look at the custom area for the toggle control, one of your options is, well, you have a number of toggle options, including the X, the block. They will reference the bitmap numbers here. Basically, any option that references bitmap numbers, here are the numbers. So you can say, well, I need bitmap 2 for off, I need bitmap 3 for on, or use whatever the appropriate numbers are to reference the bitmaps in your list to get the display that you want. I believe that the bitmap control may also reference internally loaded bitmaps, but you should check the documentation on that. Another control that definitely references internal bitmaps is the numeric control. If you set the numeric control to use the scaled bitmap option, then the bitmaps that are used are from the bitmap list. Normally you want these bitmaps to be contiguous, and you use the display offset combined with the range to access the bitmap that you want to use. So for example here, the range is 0 to 31. It means for this display, and these are all the bitmaps that you can select from, you need 32 bitmaps. Now within this editor, if we look at the bitmaps, they start at location 0. If you had, say, another bitmap or two in front, say there were 2 bitmaps before the OP1 operator 1 parameter, then you would use display offset to reference into the list, and you see when I changed the offset number, the bitmap here actually changed. And it will now correctly, you can do that to determine where the beginning bitmap is in the list. Global parameters are a list of optional global parameters available to the editor. Activate control ID, don't use this. That's all I'll say. The initialization macro. Each time your window here is activated, the initialization macro is called. So this allows the initialization macro to do 2 things. We recommend for an initialization macro that all it do is call a global macro and then do all of the work that you want to do in your global macro. And I don't actually have a global macro set up here. I've already discussed this in the macro tutorial, but I'll do a quick re-explanation here. 2 purposes. 1, each time the window is activated, you may need to do something special, like send out a small sysx message to the instrument to make sure that the instrument is placed in the same editing mode as your editor. For example, chord. You activate a combi editor, you need to send out a message to the instrument to make sure that the instrument is placed in combi editing mode as opposed to patch editing mode. So any kind of messaging that you or work that you need to do every time the window is activated, you place first. Then, if you have any messages that you only want to be executed once, what you can do is create a macro that looks something like this. All variables, when they start off, with the exception of those between 40 and 50, are set to 0. So the first time you enter this macro, the macro does a test to see if the variable v31 is equal to 1. You know that variable v31 is equal to 0, so it's going to skip over the if condition, and the first function or first macro it's going to see after the test is going to set v31 to 1. You can now do any kind of setup information, setup commands that you need for this editor in here. Say you need the v0 variable set equal to 2 as a starting point. You can do that. The next time the window is activated, it comes in here, does this test, sees that v31 is equal to 1, and hits the exit command and comes out of the macro. So that's how you handle setup. You can let this macro perform two different operations. And we will continue on with looking at global parameters. You have the option for any editor to use a custom skin. If you click the custom skin option, then the skin that Midi Quest will use is this one, accessed from within the editor itself. And you can do all the setup work that you need in that custom skin area. Align flush. Normally on the right hand side of the editor, Midi Quest adds a little bit of space to the editor, on the right hand side and the bottom side, to correspond with the little bit of space that you'll naturally place usually on the left and top side if your editor layout is like this, where you have blocks of background to lay out your editor. If you are perchance using a single monolithic bitmap as your background, then you may set this and the editor will align itself flush to the right hand side and the bottom side of the editor automatically for you. Redraw priority, leave this option unchecked. Developer lock, leave this option unchecked. For internal SoundQuest and developer use, if you choose this option, you may not be able to get back into your own editor later on. And in fact, you probably will not be able to see this option at all in your global parameters. Macro on exit. This allows you to specify a macro that will be run when you close the editor down. And you can specify any macro that you want. Again, protection search, you will probably not be able to see this option within your version of Midi Quest. And this option as well probably will not be visible in your version. We'll close this up, and that covers off the global parameters. There aren't many. Virtually all of the work you'll do within Midi Quest is on specific controls that you lay out in the editor. Custom skin is exactly the same as the standard skin editor that applies to all of the standard skin that applies to all of the editors which don't have their own custom skins. So if you want information on setting up custom skins, go to the options tutorial, and it explains how skins work there. Block setup. Within Midi Quest, in the editor menu, you will see that there is a function called block copy swap. And that allows you to do block editing. You could say, here we're working with a DX7. It has 6 operators. All of these operators are identical. So you can set up parameters here that define where each operator is located. Here's an offset, the number of bytes it uses. There's a group parameter, and there are conditional selection parameters to determine whether the option at the given time should be visible to the user. Once you set these up, the user can then just if he wants to copy all of the parameters, he or she wants to copy all of the parameters from operator 1 to operator 2, they can in one operation, or from operator 2 to operator 3. The standard editor tutorial will show how the block copy functionality actually works. But in here, what you need to do is set up each of these. So this really only works for, I shouldn't say that. If you want to be able to copy a particular block, even if there's only one of them between two editors, you can set up that block as a definition. But normally it's used for scenarios where you have two or more of a particular type of thing. The other rule is whatever this thing is must be in a contiguous data area, because this operation works on a block of data. So you can, in a DX7, you have operators found at offsets 0, 21, 42, 63, and so on. Each one of these is 21 bytes in size. So I can set all of these up and define the area. There's also a global block, which is a different area. Any of these you can modify by changing a value and hit the replace button, or if you hit the add button, a new entry will be added with these given parameters. You can move any entry up or down in the list. You can delete an entry. And here you can give, if you're adding blocks, you can give a name. There's your offset, the number of bytes that are in the block. You can also actually specify at a bit level, which is necessary for a very small number of instruments. So if you want the copy to actually start up at bit 4 of byte 21, you can specify that it's bit 4, where bit 0 is the low bit, and if your last bit you only want, or sorry, the last byte, it's only a number of bits, then you can again specify the end bit there. Maybe it's bit 6 is the last bit. Chances are, if you feel you need to use these parameters to get your editor working, you're going to end up contacting SoundQuest Tech Support for a bit more information. In this situation, Midi Quest has a lot of smarts to determine what blocks will work with other blocks. If you actually have two different types of data that have the same byte size, then you can use a group number to differentiate them. So say operators 1, 2, and 3 were somehow different from 4, 5, and 6. I could give 4, 5, and 6 a different group number. And then if I were wanted to copy operator 1 to a destination, it would only present operators 2 and 3 as viable alternatives, and if you had chosen operator 4 to copy to, it would present 4, 5, and 6 as potential destinations. I'm going to zero these back out. The next parameter is group name, and for each of your blocks you should actually specify a group name, and this is actually one of the critical methodologies that we use to correctly identify different blocks that can be copied from one to another. You'll see that all of the EGs have the same name EG. All of the operator blocks have the same name operator. And this is necessary. One of the new features in Midi Quest version 10 is the ability to actually save a block to an INI file as a resource. So if you have say a particular envelope that you really like using for a particular sort of sound, you can actually, and that's definable as a block, you can actually save that off to disk as a resource, and the resource grouping uses this name to do the save. So setting this up properly is critical. The next block are conditionals, and conditionals allow you to associate or make an option available only under a certain set of conditions. So you could say only make this option available if the value at offset 15 in the data has a value of 4. This gives you a whole series of filtering options, and they are quite important in situations where you only want this option to be available based on some setting within the editor. You can also filter based on driver ID and say this block can only be available if my driver ID has a number of 321. Since multiple drivers can access the same editor, and you can also have a situation where one editor is actually, through the use of macros, capable of editing parameters in different locations using the same editor. You need a way where these blocks are fixed. You know, this block can only work at location 105. So say you had two different types of DX7 where in one case the operator one was located at offset 105, the other one the operator was located at, say, offset 200. In the case of maybe the driver ID being 321, references the operator to 105, and you could then say add another operator 1 with an offset of 200, where the driver ID for this editor was maybe 322. Add this to the list, and in both instances you can still have an operator 1 come up, and based on the driver that has opened the editor, you will only get the appropriate selectable block. And there is one additional way of actually creating a block. And this is new to version 10 as well. And what you can do here is say, I want to make a block from, and it can be completely random, this particular set of controls for whatever reason. I can then come into block setup, say use the controls that are currently selected to create a block. Check this. I still want to type in my name and various other parameters that are relevant. Hit the refresh button. And then hit the add button. Let's give it a name. Hit the add button, and this will add a new block of controls using the control numbers rather than any other information. And I'm going to delete that. Hopefully I've given you enough information to be able to handle block setup. If not, please contact SoundQuest Tech Support. Tech notes, this is an easy one. It's just a text area for entering your comments. I would recommend that you add definitions of the use of variables. If you're using V1 to hold a particular value, put it in here. Put in any documentation on what each of your global macros does, so that when you come back and look at your editor a year from now, instead of trying to remember or sort out what each of the variables and macros does, you can just look at your tech notes. These are stored with the editor, and you can find out exactly how the editor works. Any special notes, anything that you'll need a year from now to remember how your editor functions. Control processors. These you are not likely to ever use. SoundQuest on occasion makes large-scale changes to its editors. Sometimes we find it easier to simply make a function and put it in the Midi Quest code to do a particular job that we need to do. And these are simply functions that we've needed to apply to editors at a global level in order to update them in some way. You can look through the list. If there's anything that actually ends up applying to you, great. Here's one, maybe you need to set all of your knobs to be transparent. This function will do it. Beyond that, I don't think it's worth explaining any of these options. The next submenu contains options that typically apply at a global control level. So you'll see things like align. You can select a series of controls, choose align left, and all of the selected controls will line up with the leftmost control. Align top, all of these selected controls will align themselves with the topmost control. Set width, you can select a group of controls and resize them all so that they match the largest control of the selected group, the smallest control of the selected group, or the current control, which is the one that is selected in red. You can do the same thing with height. You can modify all of the selected controls to have the same height as the largest, the smallest, or the currently selected control. These are all options that work with IDs. Cross-check IDs will give you a list of controls that have the same ID number. All controls should have their own unique ID number. If you start changing the control ID number, that is this number here, manually, it's possible for two or more controls to end up with the same ID number, which you don't want to happen. For each of your editors, we recommend when you're finished, just choose this option. Make sure that it's empty, and that will ensure that you have all unique ID numbers. Let me force this into an example that you don't want to see. So that's 30. We'll change this from 301 to 30. Cross-check IDs. now shows you that ID 30 is being used twice both by stringless controls, and it will give you the pixel location, X and Y pixel location of the two offending controls. The next option brings up a dialog that actually lists all of the IDs in use and their location. So if you do, for whatever reason, need to renumber your control IDs so that a particular set of IDs, say in a particular area, also have ID numbers that are grouped together, you can use this dialog, find an area where IDs are not currently being used, and then you can go and renumber all of your IDs and know that you're not creating ID numbers in an area that's going to conflict with other controls. Shift IDs actually allows you to add a fixed value to the ID number of all of the controls in the editor. Occasionally you will create an editor which you need to integrate into another editor or another couple of editors. This allows you, in your other editor you could find, okay, I'm not using IDs beyond the number 3000. You could look in this editor and then say, all right, I'm going to offset all of my ID numbers here by 3000. That will allow me to copy all of the controls in this editor and paste them into another editor. The next option does the exact same thing, but only applies the changes to the controls that you currently have selected. This option allows you to show just the controls within a given ID range. So what will happen here is you enter a starting control number, you enter an ending control number, and Midi Quest will hide all of the controls except those in the range that you've specified. And then there is a show all controls option under layout functions, so we can get all of our controls back and visible. This allows you to, for whatever reason, if you just want to see controls in a particular range, you can do so. And renumber selected controls does precisely that. If you choose a range of controls, you can then go in and renumber them starting with a given value. See, I want to renumber these controls starting at 5000. That will have done it. 5000, 5001, 5002, and so on. Now when you're doing this, be careful, because the program is actually smart enough to maintain links. Don't worry about what I was about to say. So we're through with the ID submenu. Set layer. You can select a group of controls and assign them to a particular layer number. Layers have already been talked about, and they are extremely useful. Layers allow you to group controls together and show and hide them as a layer, much the same way as you have layers within a graphic application. Layers are discussed further in the panel tutorial, where we discuss each of the parameters in controls. So there is your layer, and this just gives you a fast way of setting a selected group of controls to a particular layer. Layer Manager is just a little tool that we set up to allow us to quickly have a look at a particular layer or a group of layers. So if for whatever reason you need to look at all of the controls in layers 2, 6, and 12, you can select those and choose either Show Selected, which will show the selected layers and leave all of the other current controls exactly as they are, or you can opt to show just these layers and hide everything else, or you may want to actually hide these layers, in which case you can choose this option and it will hide any control with that layer setting and leave everything else as it is. Master layers is just a way of selecting your layers based on what master layer they are in, and you can then make any additional alterations on an individual layer basis if you want to. Layer List simply highlights and shows you which layers are currently being used by the editor. If you need to start a new layer, you've forgotten what layers you're already using, this will show them to you so that you can ensure that when you start assigning controls to a new layer, that you aren't messing with a layer system that you've already developed. Name and Help Editor actually shows all of your controls in a list and gives you the name and help for a given control. This just gives you a quick way of renaming controls if you need to, or adding help to a control. So if you found an operator, you can see quickly here that there is no help associated, and you could add in a help command if you need to. There's a search and replace option, so if you need to change, say, the word level to something else, and you want to apply that to, say, just the name strings, you can do that. And level has now been replaced. I think I would like to undo that. And then there's an option called Name Entry. Now, this can be extremely useful for assigning names to controls, particularly in a combi or performance type editor, a grid. Now, let me bring up a grid type editor. Now, here's one. And what makes this so useful is, say, once you've done your entire layout here, if you haven't assigned any names, then you can do something like this. Select all of your volume controls, and you can choose, I believe the keyboard equivalent is up. My apologies, I need to go into panel edit mode. Select this again. I'm going to do the keyboard equivalent. And I can now name all of these volume, and with the option replace, it simply replaces whatever text is already there. I also have prepend and append options. Now where this is nice is I can assign all of these to volume. I can quickly assign all of these, and I'm doing Control-Shift-F here, by the way. Assign all of these to pan. Assign all of these to preset. And I can continue to go up the grid until I've assigned names to all of the controls horizontally. Now I need to be able to differentiate these on a vertical basis, and I'm going to take the easy way. I'm going to select these individually, but what you would want to do is lock up controls so that you can select these as a grab and drag. And I can again now change this and say these are all part 1. Prepend, make sure you have a space there, press OK. And now if you look at each of these, what you have is part, oh I didn't put in part 1, part volume, part pan, part, let's do this for number 2, and this should be part 2, prepend. Now I've assigned that. Now I have a full unique name for each control, and I've done it very quickly as opposed to selecting each control and entering the name, selecting control, enter the name, and so on. It's an extremely useful little tool. The Edit Common Parameters submenu contains options which all, and I'm going to close this up and come back to the editor that we've been working in. These all apply to common parameter settings. So, one option that we have here that we've used for a long time, set all controls to use either the transmit macro, the send on release option, or the bulk transmit option. Here within the common area, this is affecting the COM mode. Use macro, bulk transmit, or macro on release. Sometimes we'll create an entire editor. Each control has its nice transmit macro to do individual parameter editing. And then we will find, for whatever reason, that say a particular instrument with a particular ROM version actually has a bug. And that bug doesn't allow the instrument to respond to the update macro that we've implemented. Well, this left us in a position of having to go through and change every single control to the bulk transmit option. So instead of doing that, we just added a little bit of code that allowed us to force every single control to use the particular option. So if I choose transmit macro and now look at each control, it uses transmit macro. If I now set it to bulk transmit and look at each control, it now is using the bulk transmit option. The next command is initialize, and that affects this parameter here, the default parameter, and you can set this to use. You can force the default value to 0 for all of the controls. Assign default value essentially takes the value currently stored in the display as you see it right here and writes that value into the default parameter. And that works in conjunction with the last initialize option, which is, no, actually it isn't, I'm sorry. Once you've got this set up, you can actually copy all of the defaults into the data, and there's your option to do that. Now, our next option in the common parameters requires a selection of controls. Hold on here. In this case, let's use layer 2. So just enter 2, press the OK button, and you can now see that each of these controls has been set to use layer number 2. Now, the concept of layers in Midi Quest is essentially the same as the concept of layers within a graphics application. Each of your elements can be assigned to one layer, and that layer can then either be hidden or shown. Now, if you look, the DX7 is a fairly old editor. It's one of the first that we did back in 1989. It scrolls, and if you were to look at some of the other, especially large editors, say an SY77 editor, it covers a huge amount of space and you have to scroll around to work within it. We're trying to get away from that, and instead, if you have a look at a Motif ES patch, here you have the parameters sitting within a single area, and each of these controls is assigned to a particular layer. And this layer shows amplitude, oscillators, pitch. If we click on Filter, EQ, and LFO, all of the controls on these layers have been hidden, and we're now showing the layers to give us these controls within this given working space. And the final section is common. And all of these controls are assigned to another set of layers that we've just displayed. And in fact, each of the effects, now you can see depending on the effect I select, that you get a different set of parameters. So each effect also has its own layer, and we show and hide layers depending on what is currently selected for display. It really cuts down on scrolling. On whole, it's faster and easier and cleaner to use, and is definitely beneficial, particularly in the plugin environments. So if you're developing a fairly large editor, try and use the layers concept. The layer show and hide command, ls, lh, layer show, layer hide. Check out the macros, check out the tutorials. And I'm going to close this up, and I'm going to jump back to my DX7 editor. Now the next option here is the Layer Manager. And the Layer Manager is simply an organizational tool that you can use while you're developing your editor that allows you to look at particular layers. Say, essentially what you do, you select the layers that you want to work with here. Maybe it's layer 2. You can always select more than one layer. So let's add a couple more. You have 3 functional options. One is show selected, and what that does is say, I'm going to leave everything that is currently visible in the editor visible. And when I click the OK button, I will also show any control that is assigned to layer 2, 5, or 6. The second option basically says I'm going to hide all the controls, then I'm going to show any control in layer 2, 5, and 6. So you end up seeing only the controls in 2, 5, and 6. And then hide selected says I'm going to leave everything that's visible right now, and then I'm going to hide any control that is assigned to these 3 layers. Master layers just allows you to have a quick methodology for displaying controls in a particular master layer. All these entries do is select the corresponding layer entries over here. So right now I have all the elements in master layer 0 selected. I can add master layer 1. I can remove master layer 0 and now just have master layer 1 selected. I can always make customizations to my selections afterwards. So if I ask to look at just layer 2, there are your entries in layer 2. And I am now going to show everything in master layer 0. That dialog doesn't make any changes to any controls. It's just a method of showing and hiding layers as you do development and need to look at particular portions of your editor based on their layer assignments. Layer list. This dialog simply highlights the layers that are currently in use. So right now we have controls assigned to layer 0 and layer 2. If you're about to start adding controls, you know you want to add these to a new layer number, you've lost track of which layers you have and haven't used, you can simply open up this dialog. It will show you the layers in use and you can make an appropriate decision as to what the new controls should be assigned to. The Name and Help Editor is a little tool that makes it easy to modify names and assign and modify help assignments for each of the controls. On the left-hand side, you have a list of all the controls by name. Obviously, controls that don't currently have names assigned, this window doesn't work very well with because you don't know which control you're selecting here. But it's very good if you want to assign a little help commentary to LFO delay. You can add your comment in here very quickly and you can just step through and modify or update, add whatever help information you want, and it's added immediately into the control. And you have the added benefit here. Maybe you've decided that instead of the term volume, you want to make use of the term level. You can simply do a search text, look for volume, replace it with level, and you only want to make the changes within your name. Hit search and replace, and all of those changes are made immediately. Now the last entry in control parameters is the name entry dialog, and this is a small but very useful dialog, particularly when you're dealing with editors that have grid entries. Now, let me get in here and have a look at your M1 combination. And we'll put it into panel edit mode. Now if you've created your whole editor and haven't worried about assigning names to each of these controls, then the pop-up information that you're getting isn't formatted nicely and isn't very useful. So this gives you, particularly for grids, a very fast and effective way of assigning names. For example, I'm going to lock this so that I can use it as a selection area. I'm going to shrink this down. I can select my output levels, and the key equivalent for this dialog is Control-Shift-F, and that's how I'm going to open it. And if I type in output level and choose replace, then all of these controls immediately take on the name output level. I can assign these controls to the name timbre, and I can assign these controls to the name MIDI channel. So in the space of a few seconds, I've assigned some 24 control names, at least their basic name. Now you still want a way of identifying these individually by part number. So you can again go in, and I'm going to lock these down for selection purposes. Now I want to assign all of these to the part number. So I can again just select them all, open the dialog, and type in part 1, only this time choose the prepend option and hit the OK button. And now you can see all of these controls have part 1 added to the front and added to the name, and I can simply go through and assign these to part 2, these to part 3, and so on. I can have this whole grid assigned in a matter of minutes as opposed to selecting each individual control and entering the name up here. It's a very fast, easy to use, effective little assignment dialog. I'll close that up and come back here, and we're now going to look at the Edit Common Parameters area. All of these options are used to control or modify settings found in the common area of a control. So I can select a range of controls, and I can do things like set all of these controls to use a particular macro type. Now, I must admit, these three options apply not to just the selected controls, but to all of the controls in the editor. The reason we came up with these three options is in the particularly early days, we would go through, we would assign nice update control messages to every single control, and we would release an editor, and we would then find that, say, early release versions of that instrument did not respond properly to the update commands, but would receive an entire instrument dump. So we were forced into creating two editors, one that would work as we wanted it to by updating individual parameters, and then we could simply go here, choose this option. Everything right now is set up to use the transmit macro, but bulk transmit, choose that, and every control is now set up to use the bulk transmit option, which means the entire patch is sent at the end of each parameter edit. And we could always work the other way as well if a manufacturer added the ability to edit individual parameters. The next option is initialize, and initialize works with the default parameter available to each of the editable controls. And what you can do here is choose to 0 all of the default values. You can assign the default value based on the current value of that control. So if I were to select that option, then the default value would be assigned for algorithm would be assigned to 17. The default value for feedback would be assigned to 3, and so on. So provide a way you could set up, basically go into your editor, set up all the parameters as you wanted them to be for a default assignment, and you could then just go in and set the initialize, assign default values, and you are done. You could also do the reverse. Copy defaults into data. You could essentially make a set of changes and ensure that, my apologies, you could just open up the editor, choose this option, and Midi Quest would go through each of the controls and copy the default setting of the control into the data. If you wanted, you could then save your patch that has now been initialized to the defaults off to disk, and in rare situations where you have an instrument where you actually cannot get current settings out of the instrument, you can only send them. In this scenario, you would now have a working default patch that you could use to start your editing process or send down and send down to the instrument with reasonable initialized values. The next submenu is layout functions, and this submenu contains generalized options which relate to handling the editor. Full control select you will have seen demonstrated if you watched the panel edit tutorial. Earlier on in the other editor, you noticed I selected a number of controls and locked them. Now when I locked them, what I did was I removed the ability for Midi Quest to select the control when I clicked on it. It's as if the control actually isn't there. Now this can be extremely useful when you're in a tight situation and you want, say, a way to select just these controls without selecting this one. It's pretty hard to get in and select the knobs from an edge with this control in the way, and you'll frequently run into that. So oftentimes, once you have your background controls laid out, and you notice when I click on these, they're not being selected. They've already been locked. That allows me to get in and make my tight selections. Now the problem with that is I have no way to select that control if I really need to select it. Full control select is a toggle option. If I come back to it now, you'll see that it's checked. When it is checked, even controls that are locked can now be selected and modified. Grid enabled. This is another checked option. Right now it's unchecked. When you move a control around on the let's have a look at this. Full control select. When I make a selection and move a control around, I can move it and drop it on any pixel location that I want. If I enable the grid, I can then go into Options, Preferences, and it works with these two options. Grid W is the X position, grid H is the height or Y position, and then I can change these grid settings to maybe 4 and 2. And when I work in this configuration, I am now saying that when I place a control, it can only be placed on an X boundary of 4, so it can be placed at 0, 4, 8, 12, 16, and so on, or a Y boundary of 2, so 2, 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and so on. And it enforces the particular placement in column. This is great if you're doing column work and you're trying to line things up in a column and they're messy right now. Just set up a grid, set up an alignment, and you can drag and place controls much more easily and accurately, because if you're off by a pixel, Midi Quest will automatically move the control and align it properly based on based on the grid selection. I'm going to turn these off for the moment. Next option, hopefully is obvious, show all controls. Shows every single control regardless of its layer setting. Show and select controls presents two dialogues, and it allows you to show only the controls within a given ID range. So if I would, for whatever reason, want to see the controls that I have in the range of, I'm sorry, that is wrong. Show and select controls works with a single control. If it's hidden, it shows it, and it also selects the control. So I happen to know that that control was number 301, and it's selected it. It's already displayed. The control below it has an ID of 30, so I can select that control just by choosing this option. This is useful particularly if you are currently working with the IDs, cross-check IDs. You saw this earlier. If you say have a number of IDs that you see as being duplicates, maybe they're hidden. You're having trouble finding the particular control at the location specified here. You've got a control number. You can use this function basically to show the control and select it. You can even, if you want to go so far as to hide all of the controls in the editor and then just use that function to show the single control that you needed to find and modify. Insert space allows you to move all of the controls from a particular area and move them in a given way. So what you can say here is I need to insert space, and frequently what you're trying to do is insert an area, say here and down. Perhaps I know that this is 160 as a Y position. X is 0. Let's say that Y is 160. So any control to the right of X, that's everything, and below 160 will be moved by how much? Say by 20 in the X direction, so 20 to the right, and 200 in the Y direction, so that's down. And there you can see, oh, my 160 was wrong, but if I were really doing this correctly, I would determine exactly what that point was that I wanted to work from. And what this has done is it's moved everything, either visible or hidden, down a given amount, and that gives you some space if you need to insert some controls here. This is particularly useful when you do have controls organized in layers and you do need to move everything down regardless of whether that layer at the time is visible or not. Paste override is a little utility option. When you copy a control to the clipboard and then you want to paste it back in, frequently you are or you're making duplicates. You may be pasting it in because you need to have it on another layer. So you can force the layer of the newly pasted controls into a certain layer. You can also check the option to maintain the current IDs. When you paste a control in to an editor, by default, Midi Quest assigns a new ID number that is based on the ID values currently being used in the editor. If you're moving a block of controls from one editor to another, you may know that in the destination editor that these IDs are not in use. You need to or want to maintain these ID numbers. You can just check this option and Midi Quest will not change the ID numbers. And remove linked control. This is an old function and I will probably have trouble, I'll have great difficulty finding an example quickly to show here. But in days gone by, Midi Quest didn't have these pop-up which showed the numeric equivalent of the currently pointed to control. So people often asked, hey, can I have a numeric equivalent along with this slider? So we would shrink down the size of the slider. We would have a numeric control sitting in here, so you could have the slider display plus the control. And these were linked together. So as you change that one, this one would visually update. You change this one, and your slider would visually update. Now when we added these pop-ups with the correct numeric equivalents, you didn't really need this initial control, and graphically it looked nicer without it. So what happens is, in the case where you do have a control that is linked, you can click on the control that you want and then choose this option, and it's Shift Control D is the fast way, short for delete. And what Midi Quest will do is look and see if the selected control is linked to anything, and if it is, it actually removes it. And if the two are side by side, like these two are, it actually removes the control, and then it resizes this control to use the lost space. So what you end up with is more available space for your graphic. Template options are used by SciCraft alone. I doubt that under any normal circumstances you'd ever use any of these options. Panel Edit, choose this to take the editor back out of panel edit mode. So it's the inverse of this option here. And then you have your basic panel saving options. Save panel as, and you can also save this as a floating editor. Floating editors are now very old. With today's multitasking, multi-client supported everything and plugins, chances are you're never going to create or use a floating editor. So that is the panel edit tutorial. I hope you found it useful. If you have any questions and are doing development, please email SoundQuest tech support email address, support@squest.com. Thank you. I now have an update to the explanation on the block setup section. most of what you were given was correct. You have a list of blocks. You can edit any of the blocks in this area, and that was all correct. Now the problems were in the explanation of how the blocks are handled. There are actually two different ways you can define a block. Now the first is to enter an offset into the data, the number of bytes, and optional start bit and end bit for the beginning and end bits in this block that you've defined. The alternate way to define a block is to use controls. Now when you use controls, what you need to do is the following. Select a group of controls. It can be any group, non-contiguous, contiguous, it doesn't matter. You're just selecting a group. You can now go into block setup and you give your block a name. You can leave all of the positional information blank because you're not going to use it. However, the conditional information you can still use if you want. And the most important thing here is you check this option. Use controls to create block. When you check this, then as you can see, Midi Quest will mark the number of bytes, but this is the important factor. You've got this checked here, and you can hit the add button and it will add a new entry. In the future, if you change this block definition, you can close the window up, go in, change any other group of bytes. All you need if you update the group of controls that are considered to be part of the block, you can just hit the refresh button and it will rebuild that list of controls that are used to obtain copy values. And that is the only additional information that you need.